Okay, great. So, like we mentioned in the prep kit right at the beginning of the retreat, right? So, first of all, congratulations on taking this time out. I think, especially in this time and age, we are not really conditioned to take out the time to better ourselves in a way that is not, always directly connected with external accomplishments, right? So we take out time to do different things related to work. We take out time to do different things that we think, kind of constitute entertainment, or we do pursue some hobby that requires going out and doing something. But I think it's quite valuable that all of you have taken this time to spend time with yourself, understand your mind, and see how that can lead to different outcomes, right? And I think it's a travesty that these things are not, fundamentally included in our education. We grow up learning how to deal with the external world, how to do extremely complicated calculations. We learn about the history of human society. We learn so many things, but we are never really taught what is it that's happening in our mind, how are we experiencing the world, and how that can lead to either dissatisfaction or continued happiness, right? So it's unfortunate that is not part of our education system, but thankfully, I mean, we have an opportunity. We have the great opportunity of having the teachings of the Buddha available to us, and this retreat has been an attempt to present it in a way that is, easy to follow and easy to understand, even if you don't necessarily have a grounding in understanding the history of Buddhist studies or knowing much about Buddhism or about meditation for that matter. So that is the idea of putting this together, and we do want to kind of work towards making this much more accessible to people. Today, I think it's people who really have that inclination of looking for answers, who are not satisfied with the way that the meaning, purpose, and experience of life is has been presented to them, and they feel there is something more beyond what is apparent and beyond what has been taught to us. And those are the people looking for it, and we want to kind of make it accessible to more people. So this has been a first attempt of presenting this information in this format. I have been teaching retreats that are very sutta based, and they are typically targeted with people who already have some exposure to Buddhism, or who are already convinced that the answer lies in this direction, right? And the attempt has been made to make it much more accessible. So, like I mentioned, we will begin with a quick recap. So, of what we've been looking at through the week, and talk about how you can start bringing it into your life. So, let's just start with that. I'll just share my screen. Give me a second. So, like the title suggests, right? So, the way the Buddha presented it, the problem that the Buddha set out to solve was one of suffering. It can often seem a little overbearing, especially if you're not going through a difficult time in life. It might seem like why pay so much attention to suffering. But what he really figured out was actually how the mind works, and how can you move from the processes of the mind leading to dissatisfaction, and move it towards processes that lead to satisfaction and joy, right? And the title of the slide suggests that we did discuss this. We did discuss dependent origination. We did discuss how, with different contacts, our mind tends to go down a slope of habitual and compulsive behavior, right? So when we see a certain situation, we already have a bias towards the way we are going to interpret it. We already have a bias towards the way we are going to feel about it, whether it's going to be painful or pleasant, whether we're going to take it personally, how we're going to see ourselves in that situation, how are we going to respond to it, right? So that is continued compulsive behavior. Unfortunately, you can't really, you can continue a long struggle to change external circumstances to suit you so that the contact is always favorable. You can either spend your entire life trying to keep modifying the world in a way that is acceptable to you, and in which you would probably need the cooperation of everyone else and natural forces as well. Or the other thing you can do is completely shut yourself off and say that, hey, okay, going to just be in one small little isolated island where the contact is favorable for me. Or you can pursue the middle path, right? So you can pursue the middle path of going from a compulsive existence to a conscious existence, where you're making choices more consciously. You're not making choices based on craving, which takes you down that slide of compulsiveness, right? And this is the first thing we started looking at. We started looking at how our mind can go where we do not intend it to go. It keeps seeking, it has this deep sets information seeking behavior. It keeps going into distractions, and some of those distractions become things that really bother us. We become enormous sinks of time. They take away our time. They take away our ability to do the things that we really want to do the things that are meaningful, do the things that are wholesome. Right? They can take away from that time. They can also create their own problems for you in terms of going down rabbit holes, like things that you take really personally, things that you're not really able to make a huge difference to, and leading to continued dissatisfaction. And all of us have our pet rabbit holes, whether it is related to our careers, whether it's related to our financial situation, whether it is related to family, whether it is related to bereavement, whether it is related to self-image, or your relation with yourself, your body image. So all of us have our pet rabbit holes, and these continue to give us grief. Our mind will always end up slipping there. So the first thing we do is understand why attention is important, how attention is not as much at our service as we assume it is. We think that we decided to do this and we're doing it, but it is quite possible that our attention actually got hijacked by some stimulus and inserted us into an entire world of thinking about it and then behaving compulsively about it. So we started with the using the three mental skills and started with the two of them in our practice. We started with creating our attention on a wholesome anchor. Right. Eventually, we want to bring wholesome states of being into our mind as opposed to unwholesome states. Right. So that is the movement towards conscious joy. Right. So we start with a wholesome state of metta. We start by sending loving kindness to ourselves and a friend, and we start exercising the first two mental skills. We start with mindfulness, remembering to observe how attention moves from one thing to another. And that we develop by using the 6R. Every time we realize that our attention has drifted away, we recognize, release, relax the tension and tightness that is a symptom of craving, smile and come back to that wholesome state, and repeat as often as required. So this starts to sharpen our mindfulness, our ability to note where our attention is going. And as we continue with this, our mind starts to get into little zones where our mind is stable with our object of attention and starts getting collected, right? Collected with wholesome feelings accompanying it, feeling of joy that all of you have experienced come up, right? Our mind starts getting collected, starts staying where we intended to, right? And this is a great, even whether or not we are meditating, we are all involved in wholesome activities during our lives. And what happens is our mind starts to take a hike of its own, and collectedness allows us to stay with that. This can help you be more productive, more of service to yourself and to others, right? Especially if you're able to bring your mind to a collected state without craving, you ensure that whatever you do, even if it is work, right? So, no, it's not just about productivity. The way you do your work will be in a way that it doesn't create that craving and suffering for yourself or for other people. So, it's a win win in terms of both being more effective at what you do and effective as well at uh, ensuring better mind states for yourself and for others. So that was the first thing we unpacked, and then we went into how does the mind actually interpret situations? How do we make sense of the world, and how do we respond to it, right? How does craving affect this? So one thing is to say, okay, attention goes from here to here. But once we know where attention is, what is actually happening there? So then we went into the understanding of dependent origination, right? And this is briefly, without putting all the links, briefly encapsulated this. So an information event happens. Information events are happening all around us, whether it's something we're seeing, whether it's something we're hearing, something we're tasting, something we're feeling in the body, something we're smelling, or a thought hitting our mind. Right? So we have an information event, we get new information, and if craving attaches to it, it generates a certain feeling, painful or pleasant, based on our conditioning, based on how we have historically responded to that kind of information. Starts with that. If our attention is not involved with something else, if there is craving attached to this, then we go further down. We move to the next stage, which is creating an identity to deal with that situation. And that identity, on one day I may be a son, I may be a professional, I may be a person of a certain community, I may be a person belonging to a certain region, I may have a certain nationality, I may have a certain allegiance, I may have a certain ideology. So we assume personalities suited to that. Because we have this thing happening continuously, we assume it is the same personality. But you can see the difference. We talked about the example of judges giving out completely different judgments on parole depending on how hungry they are. So literally based on that, what we call as mood is actually a something that is very fundamental and can affect very serious decision making that we do, right? So when we cling, when we create this model of ourselves and we create a model of the world, we create extremely reductive models, right? So we saw how our modeling can be wrong with the optical illusions. We saw how our modeling can be often incorrect. This is because we are extremely complex people. The world is an extremely complex place. Other people we deal with are extremely complex people. And what we do when we are clinging is we flatten everything. We just use, we literally create, it's like a mimicry of the world or a caricature of the world that we create in our mind to deal with that situation at that point. So the identity that you realize at a moment is actually a caricature of what you can be. It is a caricature of all the experiences that you've had in the past. Once we've done this, we've made sense of the environment. We've made sense of the situation, who we are, what are we dealing with, right? And with craving, where we are very desperate to get a certain outcome that we think is good for us and stay away from a certain outcome that is bad for us, right? So we move to default to habitual tendencies, compulsive behavioral patterns that we have done in the past. And we need to understand, right? So all these feelings, emotions that we have, all the reaction that we are, these are essential parts of a being that is alive. So these have come from our evolutionary background, right? So for example, getting annoyed when somebody says something to you is just a defense mechanism. It is an extension of the defense mechanism if you're being threatened by an animal, for instance, right? But what happens is these are all useful for the short term, and for the long term, they may not really be useful to us. And they may create bad states of mind for us and for other people, being, taking those feelings seriously and just making that as a base for your action. So our systems of optimization are all extremely short term. You feel like, okay, let me have another uh, slice of cake and I'll start dieting from tomorrow. So I'm sure all of you have seen some equivalent of this. So the short term mechanism in this place is that, okay, at a time when food was scarce, we had this mechanism of making the most of every opportunity to eat, and especially foods that are rich in fat and sugar, for instance, right? And now we know how that affects us because we can keep indulging in that behavior because of the underlying craving. All these mechanisms that are useful in a certain world and for very short term optimization may not be relevant today when we live in a world of, say, food security and food abundance. So this is what we looked at, and from that we also came to the very important set of discussion, right? So understanding impermanence, So when we do this world building, we normally think of things as permanent. So if we are frustrated with something, we assume this thing is going to frustrate us like this all the time. Or if we like something, we assume that we are going to like, I mean, this is the thing that is going to give us sustained happiness, and therefore we must have it, right? So we give a quality of permanence when we think about that. But the fact is, everything around us, even our thoughts, even our minds, are dependent on conditions. They're constantly in flux, they're always changing. So we always make the mistake of assuming things are permanent. So we underestimate our ability to change. So there are a lot of studies which say how people value uh, evaluated the importance that certain things will have for them 10 years from now. So who would they continue to be best friends with the same person? Would they continue to like the same bands, movies, same foods? And it was completely unrelated to what the same people reported 10 years later in a longitudinal study. Right? So many of you may have seen this. It's a very famous TED talk around this. So we underestimate our capacity to change, the world's capacity to change, the capacity of other people to change. So we do not understand the characteristic of impermanence. Things are in flux, and things are dependent on the conditions that support them, and these conditions are constantly changing. The other thing that we don't understand is that the identity that we experience at any point of time is something that has come up to deal with the situation. And if I don't like it in this moment, it means that I must bring heaven and earth together to make sure that this doesn't happen. Or, if I like something or if I don't like something, that outcome is paramount because I is involved in that. And even though we may not think actively about it, the I assumption is that something, it is that eternal I, right? And again, this kind of understanding is useful in short-term circumstances, right? If you had no sense of that I, you will not survive one day. You will walk into traffic, you will chop your hands off, you will slip on the floor, you might do a lot of things. So it is very useful for that short term. But when we start taking that personality very seriously, we start identifying it for a long term. Okay, this person said something to me, and now I must resent this person, I must hate this person, or I must be fearful of the impact it may have on my reputation. So when we don't understand impermanence and impersonality, the thought process that we have, the way we think about the world, the way we think about our lives leads to dissatisfaction continuously. So that is the third major thing that we unpack, right? So these three characteristics, and starting to see that in our own practice as well, right? We understand that thoughts arise and thoughts go away. You might often see that thoughts arise related to a discussion you had maybe just before you sat or your current workday, right? So thoughts arrive and disappear. They are dependent on conditions, right? And because one thought arrived, a related thought might arrive. They always arrive because they're dependent on conditions. They stay while the conditions support them, and they go away when the conditions don't support them. If you don't give attention to them, the condition doesn't support those thoughts, they dissipate. If you use the 6 hours, after a while, they will dissipate, right? So we understand impermanence in our own practice. We also understand impersonality to some extent. We see that the thought process we get into, and we feel like we are thinking something, and we feel like we actively chose to think that thing, right? That is actually happening because we continue to pay attention to something that came up on its own. A thought popped up. You didn't ask for it to pop up. You didn't say that, let me be distracted 45 seconds into my sitting, right? So something came up, and then your mind grasped around it and it became personal. So you understand that these things are not related. These are not related to a permanent sense of self. These are things that are happening, and the personality that you're developing is momentary. And you realize this personality also fall away as you use the 6 hours. Immediately, from 1 second, from being that identity that is thinking about a particular situation, you are back to being with your object of meditation, right? Once we start understanding this, we are able to let go of the craving and act appropriately, act in a way that is wholesome, that doesn't lead to suffering for oneself and for others. And this helps us to understand what is the path, the compulsive slope, the craving driven slope that leads to dissatisfaction, and the conscious, the cravingless, approach that leads to better outcomes. And this is something, of course, you will need to, you can see it in your practice. You can see it in the way it affects your mind, uplifts your mind state during these days of continued practice. And I hope to hear your individual experiences about that. But you will see that, and the more and more you bring it into your daily life, you will see how there is always a choice to move towards a conscious existence where you have an extremely large self-image, right? So your identity that becomes small and constricted, unable to do things because the world is not cooperating, to something that is always has the power to make a positive change in the world, if even if it is just being able to smile or send good intentions to yourself and to other people around you, right? So you start assuming that identity that is not a slave to the external conditions. That is the conscious existence taking agency of your own happiness, right? So that is what we've been working towards, both in terms of understanding the Eightfold Path. We discussed that there are three aspects to following the Eightfold Path: understanding how the mind works intellectually and enriching it by actually seeing it in your own practice experience. The three skills that constitute the practice, which we cultivate in meditation: harmonious practice, mindfulness, and collectedness, right? So we cultivate these. Through this, we enrich our understanding, and we, the third aspect being behavior. We start with taking the precept, we start with behavior that is conducive for our mind to be able to see that there is an alternative to continued compulsive existence, right? We start with that, and over time we start integrating. We already see that affecting that feedback loop affecting how we behave in life, because our conditioning is continuously being updated towards being more wholesome. And with the frameworks, for instance, we can start actually making this much more prevalent in our world, moving towards that conscious existence, moving towards more joy, moving towards having agency over your own happiness and state of mind. So that was a brief summary of what we covered. What do you do from this point? So this retreat has helped you go deep into understanding these things, but you need to continue practicing this, and it is very important because the mind will regress to old patterns. Your mind is conditioned for years and years with the older patterns, so you need to continue with the practice. As you continue the practice, your mind will go deeper. You'll start getting deeper insights about your mind, about different situations, about uh, how you can modify your behavior. So three things that support a happy life: generosity, keeping the precepts, and mental development. Generosity, again, like the smile is the least that you can do. Keep your mind in the Brahma Viharas all the time. Seek out specific opportunities to be generous, right? We can be generous as a default in life when dealing with people around us, uh, when dealing with situations. Take out time to do something generous for someone, something that is not expected, something that you don't have an agenda connected with. So try to find those things. We will also try and point you in the direction of some things that you can do, for instance. But there are lots of opportunities to be generous. You will be able to find it on your own. Right? The precepts are very important. They are not a ledger of, so your good deeds and bad deeds. Not going to affect whether you get toys from Santa, but precepts are something that protect your own practice, right? Those are precepts help you from going into serious compulsive pattern. So every time we break a precept, we are actually getting into extremely compulsive patterns, and those are reinforcing the wrong kind of conditioning within us. There is a contentious precept of consuming intoxicants, and a lot of people in today's world do live in circumstances where it almost doesn't become optional, or you have a long-standing habit of it, right? So my comment on that is the precept on intoxicant actually helps us to avoid slipping on the other precepts. If you feel uh, like you can consume intoxicant and not break the precepts, I will assure you that it will happen. Even if you're not breaking the precepts in action, you will be breaking the precepts in thought because your mindfulness slips away. Find your balance, get there. Again, it's not a permanent sin. It's not something that is always, it's not a black mark against your name, but find a way to be more moderate or, move away from intoxication because it'll take you that much longer to move towards a conscious existence. So it is a choice you have to take. It's a price you have to place on your, uh, on being able to access that continued state of conscious existence. So find your balance, get there. Don't be kind to yourself if you make mistakes. Forgive yourself as you would a child. Uh, think of yourself, even in terms of the effort, the daily effort, the development of your mind. It is always good to have fun while learning. Uh, Try to have the same attitude you had when playing video games. So making a mistake is not the end of the world. You just learn and you get better the next time. Keep an attitude that you would with a friend, right? With a dear friend or a child, right? If they make a mistake, help them climb out of that. So keep that same attitude towards yourself. If you make a mistake, forgive yourself. You can share it with a friend who's doing the practice or with a guide, right? You can just share that because sharing that, verbalizing it actually helps you to be mindful in future. So have that attitude towards it. Be kind. So be supportive of your own growth, right? So don't be judgmental. Don't be like, I need to sit 5.5 hours, otherwise I'm doomed. Or don't have that attitude. Make sure it is fun. If it is not fun, you will not do it, and unfortunately, the loss will be yours. So try to, the way you would create a good learning environment for a child, create a learning environment for yourself. I would highly recommend getting at least one 30-minute sitting in every day in the morning. It clears up your mind state, your attitude for the rest of the day. And it'll keep you more mindful. It'll keep your practice going. So that's a recommendation from my side. Again, figure out how you can do it. In all probability, there will be a bunch of useless things that you do that you can substitute if you plan your time consciously. So if you can, please do that. I am not trying to be insulting of your time management skills, but knowing that the kind of cravings that rule the mind, I'm sure you will be able to find something that you can substitute for a practice that will give you long-standing happiness, right? The other thing that you can do, even if it is totally not possible, even if it is possible to do the 30-minute sitting, is identify opportunities for active meditation. So Amaransh was flying yesterday, right? So the entire journey, transit to the airport, checking in, and checking in. When you check in, you actually notice how dark people are. Right? Nobody's smiling. Everybody's restless, checking their watch every time. Either they're desperate to make sure they get checked in, or they're frustrated about having to wait. And you see the faces around you. Please make a note of it next time you do that, or if you're waiting for a meeting and see the people around you, see your own mind state. So everybody's glued to their phone, consuming mostly irrelevant pieces of information, or getting frustrated, or going into their rabbit holes, right? So start identifying opportunities for active meditation, right? Cab ride waiting at the airport, flight, land, cab ride from there to wherever you need to go. Just one example. There'll be other times like daily commute that you might have, uh, time that you're doing routine tasks at home, walking the dog, washing clothes, cooking, cleaning. So those are all opportunities for active meditation, and those are all times that your mind is actually creating, it's just doing nothing useful at that time, right? So those are extremely valuable. And the other thing that active meditation does is it reinforces your ability to be mindful even when you are in the middle of a very challenging situation, right? Fourth thing, cultivate your intuition, right? So your intuition is essentially all the experiences you've had till date together, right? And your intuition has more intelligence than you will ever be able to logically use. And especially for complex situations, especially for situations that require subjective decision making, especially for situations that require dealing with other people. So logic is great for dealing with inanimate objects, doing your balance sheets and profit and loss statements, doing your taxes. It's great for that. But intuition is extremely valuable. And intuition also kicks in differently depending on whether there is craving in your mind or not. If there is no craving, for example, when you look at somebody, you might have a certain intuition. If you have craving in that situation, it might be very different from if you are actually in a wholesome state of mind. So developing your intuition in a wholesome state of mind is extremely, extremely valuable. I cannot emphasize how valuable this is. Ask yourselves questions before you sit. So it may be a simple question about why can't I sit longer, or why do I get up, right? Or it can be questions related to something that you need to do. Okay, how do I solve this problem, or how do I, you know, do one thing or the other, play around with it. What will happen is when your mind goes into deeper states, you will get some thought that comes up that actually gives you a wholesome solution. As your mind is not based in craving, you will get a suggestion that is wholesome. And it takes a while to develop this because initially it will be very small. And over time, it becomes something that your mind also gets used to it. That hey, a question was placed before me before I sat down, and now I will provide an answer, and the mind will also listen to that answer. So that is something you start developing, because this will start becoming as you keep developing it. Like your mindfulness will start to become real time in any circumstance. Your intuition will also start becoming real time and tell you, right, when we intellectually understand, okay, take actions that are wholesome and that are do not cause suffering for others and for you. Almost nowhere will you find it able to actually reason through that entire flow of consequences and take an action at that moment. So that's what you need your intuition for. Your intuition will naturally guide you towards what is wholesome. One other thing for those who want to deepen the practice, it's very useful. So after a certain level of practice, if you start exposing yourself to sutta or dhamma talks, right? So we'll let you know dhamma talks that will be happening, or start reading suttas. Couple of suttas were shared. I think Sutta Central, you do find free access to all the suttas. They may be a little challenging to begin with, but over time, it's very useful to understand what is being said, and it starts deepening your understanding of the mind. Again, this is for people who can take out the time and who are more serious about developing their practice. This is takes time, but the learning is very deep and lasting. Right? So it's more of a marathon in learning, but you can start building this habit if you're able to do it. So these are some suggestions in kind of that you can do to continue your practice. The other thing is actually making a difference in your life, in what you do, how you behave, right? So what you can start with is start with small wins, right? So you can either pick up a habit or you can drop one habit. Like start with something very small, and habits are always driven by craving, right? So normally you have so when we talk about dropping a habit, we have a craving associated with that habit, right? Eating something sweet after every meal, or you know, phone obsessive time spent on the phone, having a cigarette right after you eat. So those are things where you can anticipate, you know exactly when that habit kicks in, right? So you can anticipate, use the 6 hours, allow that craving to do down. Remember the repeat step, the last step, right? The craving will not go down. 6 hours is not a stick to beat your craving with. You need to allow it to dissipate and see if you're able to behave differently, right? Or the other way down, right? Other way around. If you want to pick up a new habit, you normally end up scheduling time, but you may feel lazy about it. New habit requires exceptional amount of effort from the mind to actually learn something, right? So you schedule a time for it, and you just like you do for your meditation practice, right? You say that I'm going to do this. Every time my mind wanders away, makes up an excuse not to do this, takes it away somewhere else. You 6 hour and bring it back and stay with the object, right? So your object becomes whatever you want to do. So try with some small wins, not maybe the most challenging circumstance in your life, can change your behavior towards that, but these are things that will give you confidence, right? The other important part of these small wins is time management. So especially time that our mind spends wandering, or the fact that we want to do something but we don't are not able to do it because our time management is weak. So start working with time management, setting out specific time, and during that time just staying with the object, being collected, not doing anything else, right? So that is a way that you can start working with time management. Eventually, one of the big things that our mind does is cycle through to-do lists, right? So if your to-do list is actually slots on calendar, and you have built the ability to be collected when you're performing them, right? So you can keep your mind clean of a lot of restlessness, and it can also help you be much more effective at getting things done. So we will have planned to have some more deep dives on these areas, but for the purpose of just wrapping up the retreat, I just want to call out these things so you can start uh, trying them out in daily life. Finally, for more challenging circumstances where you literally know you're going to behave in a certain way and you end up behaving that way. You literally know how you're going to feel in that situation and you end up feeling that in that situation. And no matter what you do in real time, you're not able to change it, right? Use the framework we discussed yesterday. See if there is something you can do to modify the environment, change or eliminate the way the contact happens. Observe the feeling, see how attached you are, how intense is the painful or pleasant feeling. Use the 6 hours continuously with craving, because that will lead you to your more compulsive uh, behavioral patterns. And then separately, not in that moment, not while you're meditating, do a writing exercise, do a journaling exercise of this. Try to identify your world building activity, right? You're making sense of the world. You have an identity that you assume, and that identity feels a certain way. It feels enraged, it feels insulted, it feels betrayed, it feels frustrated, it feels it lusts after something. So try to understand what is that self image you have created. Is it powerful? Is it capable? Is it wholesome? Or is it something that is restricted? Is it feeling in a certain way? See what can be an alternative to that. How can you imagine a different how can you stop being limited by that sense of identity that you're assuming? See how you're modeling the world and other people, right? Again, we flatten very, very complex realities for the purpose of that moment. What can be a different way to flatten it? What can be a different image we can have of other people? How can our mind state, how can our identity change the way it is reflect the world is seen? Because the world always reflects the mind state that you are seeing. So try to see that in an you can actually write these things down, put it in an exercise. See, instead of your compulsive behavior, what kind of options you might have, and see what would could be the different consequences of doing that. Understand, also identify the consequences. So one, we don't always think of consequences. For example, if we have an argument, we don't think of the consequence of the amount of pain that gets into our system, the amount of time we spend waste thinking about it, the changes that we're doing in our conditioning. So think about the consequences that are happening with compulsive behavior and what could be the alternative to that. So write these things down, and all those plans may go bust when you're in that same situation again. But your mind is now alert to new possibilities. So let your mind learn, let your intuition strengthen. Okay, that was a long and fast monologue from my side, and now we'll have something more interesting, which is after a long sequence of one-way communications, we will have everybody sharing. I would love to hear. So these are the two things that we'd love to hear. Please feel free to say, add anything, not respond to these questions. These are just some cues for you to think about. Mridul, if you can just go round the call and invite people to share their experience of the retreat. Did you see any changes? Did this practice lead to some immediate changes you could sense in your daily lives? Uh, out of the things we discussed, out of your practice, was there something that stood out to you? And how do you see yourself, using this going forward? So I'll take a break and hydrate, and would invite everybody to share